When I first arrived in Vietnam, I wasn't prepared for how different everything felt. It was March of '68, and the moment I stepped off the transport plane into the sticky air, I felt like I'd been dropped on another planet. The heat hit me first, thick and oppressive, wrapping itself around me like a wet blanket. It wasn't just the weather, though, it was the tension. The air itself seemed to hum with it, the kind of tension that gets into your bones and doesn't let go. I was assigned to a platoon station just outside Da Nang. They called it a base, but to me, it looked like a collection of makeshift shelters and hastily dug trenches. The first night, I lay awake listening to the crickets and the occasional distant thud of artillery fire. I wasn't scared, not yet. Mostly, I was just trying to wrap my head around the reality of being so far from home, in a place where even the plants seemed like they wanted to kill you. We were there for one reason: to patrol the jungle, find the enemy, and disrupt their operations. The terrain was unforgiving, dense with undergrowth and vines that clawed at your boots as you walked. My first patrol was a surreal experience. Every rustle in the brush made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't long before I realized that this war wasn't about battles like the ones I'd seen in movies. It was about survival. Our squad leader was a grizzled sergeant named Harris. He had a way of looking through you, like he could see exactly how green and terrified you were. I remember him saying, "Keep your eyes open, keep your spacing, and keep your mouth shut." It sounded simple enough, but nothing about that jungle was simple. On one of my first patrols, we stumbled across a clearing that reeked of decay. Harris signaled for us to spread out and search. That's when we found it, a makeshift campsite, abandoned in a hurry. There were scraps of cloth and ration tins scattered around, but the thing that stuck with me was the silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was an absence, like the jungle itself was holding its breath. We didn't know it then, but we were walking into enemy territory, and they were watching us every step of the way. That night, we set up camp near a shallow creek. Harris assigned me to watch duty, and I sat there in the darkness, gripping my rifle so tight my knuckles ached. The jungle came alive at night with sounds, chirps, croaks, the occasional rustle of leaves. Every sound felt like a warning. I don't think I blinked once during that entire shift. At some point, I caught a faint movement out of the corner of my eye. My heart shot into my throat as I strained to see what it was. It turned out to be nothing, just a bird flitting through the branches. But in that moment, I realized how easy it would be to lose myself to fear. Fear was the enemy as much as the Viet song. That was the night I started to understand the rhythm of the jungle. It wasn't about controlling it. You couldn't control something so wild. It was about adapting, about finding a way to survive in a world that didn't care if you lived or died. The longer you're in a place like Vietnam, the more you start to notice the small things. The smell of damp earth after the rain, the distant chatter of monkeys, the way the jungle seemed to shift and breathe with you. It wasn't comforting, not exactly, but it became a strange kind of normal. After that first patrol, we fell into a routine, if you could call it that. Days blurred into nights as we moved from village to village, trying to make sense of a war that often didn't seem to have rules. The missions were always the same. Clear an area, search for weapons caches, disrupt enemy operations. It sounded straightforward, but the reality was anything but. One morning, we were tasked with securing a supply route that intelligence believed the Viet Cong were using to move equipment. I remember Harris briefing us while squatting in the dirt, the steam from his coffee mixing with the early morning mist. "Stick to the trail," he said, his voice low. "Eyes sharp. They like to booby-trap these routes." The jungle seemed quieter than usual as we moved out. I was near the middle of the column, my rifle at the ready, scanning the dense foliage for any sign of movement. The path was narrow, flanked by thick undergrowth that made it impossible to see more than a few feet off the trail. I kept my focus on the boots of the guy in front of me, trying to match his pace. It was a mistake, one I'd never make again. The explosion came out of nowhere, a sharp, ear-splitting crack that sent a wave of heat and dirt washing over us. I hit the ground instinctively, my ears ringing, my heart pounding. When I looked up, the jungle was in chaos. The guy at the front of the column had tripped a mine. He was gone, just gone. The blast had taken him and shredded the undergrowth around us. Harris was already barking orders, his voice cutting through the confusion like a whip. Spread out. Watch for more traps. We scrambled to obey, moving off the trail in a loose formation. My hands were shaking as I gripped my rifle, the adrenaline coursing through me like fire. The smell of burned vegetation and something sharper, something metallic, hung in the air. We'd barely regrouped when the gunfire started. It came from the trees, the sharp crack of AK-47s cutting through the jungle. I dove for cover behind a fallen log, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The others were doing the same, returning fire in short bursts as Harris called out positions. Time seemed to stretch and contract in strange ways during that firefight. One moment I was squeezing the trigger, the next I was reloading, my fingers fumbling with the magazine. I could hear the shouts of my squad mates, the sporadic pop of grenades, and the unnerving whistle of rounds cutting through the air. Somehow, we managed to push them back. The firing slowed, then stopped altogether, leaving us in a tense, eerie silence. Harris signaled for us to hold position while he and another guy scouted ahead. I stayed crouched behind the log, my heart still racing, trying to catch my breath. When they came back, Harris looked grim. "We've got wounded," he said. "Doc, get up here." Our medic, a skinny kid from Ohio named Jensen, moved forward to check on the injured. One of the guys, a private named Martinez, had taken shrapnel to the leg. It didn't look good. The other was Miller, one of the newer recruits. He'd been hit in the shoulder and was pale, but still conscious. We rigged up a stretcher for Martinez and started the slow, grueling process of getting out of there. Every step felt like it could be my last, my eyes scanning the ground for traps, the trees for movement. My nerves were shot, but I didn't dare let my guard down. By the time we made it back to the forward operating base, I was running on fumes. Martinez was rushed to the field hospital, and Miller went with him. The rest of us sat in the dirt, too tired to talk. Someone passed around a pack of smokes, and we lit up in silence, the glow of the cigarettes cutting through the dim light of dusk. That night, I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling of the tent. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. I thought about Martinez and wondered if he'd make it. I thought about the guy at the front of the column, the one who'd tripped the mine. I didn't even know his name. I didn't sleep much that night. None of us did. The next day, Harris called us together for another mission. It didn't matter that we were still shaken, still raw. There was always another mission. That was the thing about Vietnam. It didn't wait for you to catch your breath. We were moving again before sunrise, the jungle swallowing us whole. By the time we were a few weeks into that deployment, the jungle felt more like a predator than a place. It breathed, it moved, it held secrets in its shadows. You could almost feel it watching you, waiting for a misstep. For all the enemies we faced out there, the traps, the sniper fire, the mortar rounds, it was the jungle itself that seemed to wear us down the most. One thing you learned quickly was to listen to your instincts, even when you didn't fully understand them. Harris called it spider sense, and he was the best at it. He'd stop us dead in our tracks with a hand gesture, staring into the trees like he could hear something the rest of us couldn't. Most of the time, he was right. One of those times was during a patrol near the edge of a village. The mission was standard: scout the area, make contact with the locals, and look for anything out of place. I was walking point that day, which meant every step felt like it might be my last. My eyes scanned the ground for trip wires, my ears tuned to every rustle of leaves. We'd been moving for hours when Harris called a halt. I turned to see him crouching down, his hand on the ground. His eyes narrowed as he pointed to a cluster of leaves just off the trail. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then I caught it, the faint gleam of metal under the foliage. It was a booby trap, rigged with a tripwire so thin you'd never see it unless you were looking for it. Harris disarmed it with a calm efficiency that still amazes me to this day. If he hadn't spotted it, I might not be here to tell this story. That patrol turned out to be uneventful in the grand scheme of things, but it stuck with me. It was a reminder that the jungle didn't forgive mistakes, and neither did the enemy. A few days later, we were ordered to secure a ridge overlooking a small river valley. Intelligence suggested that the Viet Cong were using the area as a staging ground, but as usual, the details were vague. We moved out at first light, the morning mist clinging to the ground as we picked our way through the undergrowth. The climb was brutal. The ridge was steep, covered in loose dirt and jagged rocks that made every step a struggle. By the time we reached the top, we were drenched in sweat and gasping for air. Harris gave us a few minutes to rest before assigning positions. The view from up there was breathtaking, though none of us were in the mood to appreciate it. The river snaked through the valley below, its surface glinting in the sunlight. Beyond it, the jungle stretched out in an unbroken sea of green, its secrets hidden beneath the canopy. We set up a perimeter and settled in to wait. That was another thing about Vietnam. There was a lot of waiting. You'd sit there for hours, staring into the trees, your nerves stretched thin as you waited for something to happen. Something always did. It was late afternoon when we saw movement at the edge of the river. At first, it was just a flash of color, a dark shape darting between the trees. Then more figures appeared, moving in a loose formation toward the water. They were Viet Cong, maybe a dozen of them, armed and clearly in no rush. Harris gave the signal, and we opened fire. The first burst of gunfire sent them scattering, some diving into the water, others disappearing into the jungle. I fired until my rifle clicked empty, then ducked behind cover to reload. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the magazine. The return fire came quickly, bullets chewing through the foliage around us. It was chaos, shouts, explosions, the sharp crack of rifles. I could barely hear Harris over the noise as he called out orders, directing our fire toward the riverbank. I don't know how long the firefight lasted. Time seemed to lose all meaning in moments like that. All I know is that when it was over, the silence was almost deafening. We crept down to the river to assess the damage. The Viet Cong had left in a hurry, abandoning weapons and supplies in their retreat. Harris ordered us to gather what we could carry and destroy the rest. I remember wading into the water to retrieve a rifle, the coolness of it a stark contrast to the heat of the firefight. We spent the night on the ridge, taking turns on watch. I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying the events of the day over and over. It wasn't the first time we'd been in combat, but something about that fight had shaken me. Maybe it was the way the enemy had melted into the jungle, vanishing as quickly as they'd appeared. Or maybe it was the realization that it could just as easily have been us who didn't make it out. The next morning, we made our way back to base, exhausted but alive. The guys joked and laughed as we walked, their voices carrying through the trees. It was their way of coping, I think, a way to push back against the fear and the grief. But for me, the jungle felt heavier that day, like it was pressing down on me with a weight I couldn't shake. I kept my eyes on the ground, one step at a time, wondering how much more of this I could take. I didn't know it then, but the worst was yet to come. It wasn't long after the firefight at the river that things took a turn for the worse. The monsoon season hit us hard, turning the jungle into a soggy, miserable mess. The rain seemed endless, coming down in heavy sheets that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Everything we owned was soaked. Our boots squelched with every step, our gear was slick with mud, and even our ponchos were useless against the downpour. But the worst part wasn't the rain. It was the mud. Thick and relentless, it clung to everything, sucking at our boots and slowing us down to a crawl. Patrols became grueling slogs, every step a battle against the terrain. Harris kept us moving, though, his voice sharp and unwavering despite the conditions. One of those patrols led us to a village we hadn't visited before. It was small, just a cluster of thatched huts surrounded by rice paddies, but something about it felt off. The villagers were quiet, too quiet, and their eyes followed us with a mix of fear and suspicion as we approached. Harris didn't like it. "Stay sharp," he muttered, his hand resting on the butt of his rifle. We spread out, checking the huts for weapons or supplies. I was with two other guys, moving cautiously through the muddy paths between the homes. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified by the rain. That's when we found the tunnel. It was hidden beneath a pile of firewood, the entrance barely large enough for a grown man to fit through. Harris came over to take a look, his expression grim. "VC hideout," he said, his voice low. "We need to clear it." I felt my stomach drop. I'd heard stories about those tunnels. Narrow, claustrophobic, and full of traps. They were death traps for anyone unlucky enough to go inside. Still, orders were orders. I volunteered to go in, partly out of duty, and partly because I didn't want anyone else to take the risk for me. Harris nodded, handed me a flashlight and a sidearm. The first thing I noticed as I crawled into the tunnel was the smell, damp, earthy, with a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The walls were close, brushing against my shoulders as I moved forward on my hands and knees. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the packed dirt ahead. I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to ignore the pounding of my heart. Every inch forward felt like an eternity, my senses on high alert for any sign of a trap. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls narrowing even further in places, until I felt like I could barely move. Then I saw it, a faint glint of metal in the beam of my flashlight. A tripwire. I stopped cold, my breath catching in my throat. My hands were shaking as I examined the wire, trying to figure out how to disarm it without triggering whatever it was connected to. Sweat dripped down my face despite the cool air of the tunnel, and my fingers felt clumsy as I worked. Somehow, I managed to cut the wire without setting off the trap. I let out a shaky breath, my relief short-lived as I realized there could be more. I pressed on, my body tense with the effort of staying alert. After what felt like hours, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. There were crates stacked against the walls, their contents covered with tarps. I pulled one back to reveal a cache of weapons, rifles, grenades, and boxes of ammunition. I radioed back to Harris, my voice barely steady as I relayed what I'd found. He told me to get out of there fast. I didn't need to be told twice. The crawl back felt even longer than the way in. Every sound seemed magnified, every shadow a potential threat. When I finally emerged into the open air, gasping and covered in dirt, Harris clapped me on the shoulder. "Good work," he said, his voice gruff but genuine. "We destroyed the cache with explosives, the blast shaking the ground beneath our feet." The villagers watched from a distance, their faces unreadable. I wondered what they thought of us, whether they saw us as saviors or invaders, whether they would mourn the loss of the weapons or be relieved that the VC wouldn't be coming back for them. That night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of the tunnel haunted me, the oppressive darkness, and the constant fear of what might be around the next corner. I lay in my bunk, staring at the underside of the tarp above me, and wondered how much more I could take. The answer came a few days later. We were ambushed on a routine patrol, the enemy hitting us hard and fast from a concealed position. I hit the ground as bullets ripped through the air, my rifle up and firing before I even had time to think. It was chaos. The jungle erupted with the sounds of gunfire and shouting, the sharp crack of explosions shaking the ground. I crawled to cover behind a fallen tree, my heart pounding as I scanned the area for targets. Harris was shouting orders, his voice cutting through the noise, but I could barely hear him over the roar of the firefight. My squad mates were scattered, some pinned down, others returning fire as best they could. I saw one of the guys, Martinez, I think, go down, clutching his leg as blood pooled beneath him. The medic was already moving toward him, his bag slung over one shoulder, but the enemy fire was relentless. I don't remember much about what happened after that. Everything blurred together. The noise, the fear, the desperation to survive. I remember firing until my rifle clicked empty, reloading with shaking hands, and firing again. When it was over, the jungle was silent except for the ragged breathing of the survivors. The enemy had retreated, leaving behind a scene of destruction. We'd lost 2 men. Martinez was alive, but barely, his leg shattered by a bullet. We rigged a stretcher for him and started the long trek back to base. That night, as I sat by the fire with the others, I felt a weight settle over me that I couldn't shake. The jungle had taken something from us, something we couldn't get back. And I realized, sitting there in the flickering light, that it wasn't just the jungle or the enemy that we were fighting. It was the war itself, this endless, grinding machine that chewed up everything in its path. The day we left the jungle for good, the air felt different, lighter, almost forgiving. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot, but our orders had changed, and we were pulling back. I remember looking over my shoulder at the dense trees as the choppers lifted us out, wondering if I'd ever feel that weight again. Years later, I can still hear the jungle, the rustling leaves, the sharp cracks of gunfire, the hum of life and death in the air. I think about the men who didn't make it out, their faces blurred by time, but their sacrifices clear as day. The jungle took something from me, something I'll never get back. But it also gave me lessons in survival, in camaraderie, and in the sheer will to keep going when everything seemed impossible. Even now, in the quiet moments, I catch myself drifting back to those days. And though I'll never forget the fear or the loss, I'll always carry the strength we found in each other, deep in the shadows of the jungle.